The train screeched to a halt at Dry Hollow Station, its iron wheels grinding against rusted rails as a cloud of red dust rose into the hot evening air. People bustled on the wooden platform, merchants carrying crates, mothers gathering children close, cowboys stepping off with heavy boots. And then stepping down last from the train came Tina. She was tall, taller than most men there, her frame broad-shouldered, built from years of hard labor under the desert sun. Her skin carried the bronze tone of her Apache blood, and her long black hair, braided loosely, brushed against her back as she carried a battered old suitcase in one hand. It was all she had. In her chest, a fragile hope flickered. A letter had promised her a future, a husband, a home, a chance to finally belong. She had believed in that promise with everything she had left. Then she saw him, Caleb Morton, the man who had written, a young merchant standing sharp and smug in a finely tailored coat. At first, Tina felt her lips curve into the faintest smile, ready to take a step forward. But the moment Caleb's eyes landed on her, his expression twisted into disgust. He barked out a laugh, bitter and cutting, loud enough for the crowd to hear. I thought I was marrying a refined lady, and instead they send me this? A woman built like a man. Who could ever call that a wife? The words cut through Tina like a knife. A hush fell across the platform, and then whispers. Murmurs spread like wildfire, some faces sneering, others chuckling cruelly. A boy pointed at her and shouted, "Mama, look!" The giant woman. Heat burned in Tina's cheeks, her hand trembling against the suitcase handle. The laughter was everywhere now, pressing against her from all sides. She swallowed back the tears, refusing to let them fall in front of them. Caleb turned, his voice dripping with contempt. I don't want her. Not now, not ever. And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing alone in a sea of mockery. Tina's knees weakened, and she sank down onto the wooden bench at the station, clutching the suitcase like it was the only anchor in the world. Around her, whispers hissed. Too big for a woman. She'll never find a man. She was a fool to think anyone would want her. She curled inward, as if she could make herself smaller, invisible. Her broad shoulders trembled, her head bowed, and yet somewhere deep inside her pride forced her chin up again, even though her heart felt like shattered glass. The humiliation was heavy, crushing, but familiar. She had lived her whole life enduring scorn. Too tall, too strong, too quiet. Wrong blood, wrong face, wrong everything. Always the one mocked, always the one left behind. But this was supposed to be her chance. A husband, a new beginning, future, and now it was gone. Inside her, something hardened. The shame was unbearable, but beneath it burned a silent fire. If the world would not give her a place, she would carve one out herself. The red dust swirled again, as the last of the crowd began to drift away, the laughter echoing faintly in the distance. Tina remained on the bench, shoulders stiff, suitcase by her feet. To everyone else, she was a spectacle, a mistake. To herself, she was nothing but a woman once more abandoned, left to the wind. But not everyone turned their back. From across the platform, one pair of eyes lingered. A man stood silent in the shadows of the station's far end. His weathered leather coat hung heavy on his frame, his hair streaked with gray, his face worn with the lines of a hard life. His name was Elias Ward. He was a rancher, a man who kept to himself. He had buried a wife years ago, and had lived alone ever since on a patch of barren land west of town. He had no business interfering in another man's cruelty, no reason to step forward, and yet he didn't move. There was something in the sight of the Apache woman, tall and proud even through her humiliation, that struck a chord deep within him. She sat alone, her black eyes glistening with unshed tears, her hands gripping the suitcase like it was the last piece of her soul. Elias Ward had always been known as a man of silence, a man who carried his grief without burdening others. But as he stood there in the dying light, he realized one simple truth. He could not walk away. For the first time in years, something stirred in his chest, a spark of recognition, a whisper of duty, or perhaps something more. He knew only this. The woman left behind would not remain alone tonight, and that, my friends, was the moment everything began to change. The sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in deep crimson, when Elias Ward finally stepped forward. The crowd that had gathered at Dry Hollow Station hushed as his boots hit the wooden planks. He wasn't a man people expected to meddle. He was known for his silence, for his solitude. But the weight in his gray eyes kept every onlooker still. Tina looked up, her tear-darkened gaze sharp with suspicion, like a wounded animal ready to fight. She expected another insult, another laugh, another hand pushing her further into the dirt. But Elias didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He didn't pity. He stopped in front of her, the station's dust swirling around his boots. His voice came low and gravel-rough, steady as stone. "Come with me," 3 words. Nothing more. For a moment, Tina froze. Her mind raced, flooding with questions. Who is he? Why would he care? Is this just another trap? But when her eyes met his, she saw no ridicule. No hunger, no cruelty. Just the stillness of a man carved out of the land itself. Elias bent down, lifted her suitcase with one hand and turned without waiting for an answer. Slow steps, deliberate, each one ringing against the wooden planks. The crowd held its breath. Then whispers rose again. The rancher's lost his mind. What's he want with her? God help him if he thinks she'll make a wife. Tina's pulse hammered in her ears. She could stay there in the ashes of her humiliation, or she could follow the stranger. After everything, she had nowhere else to go. With a slow, trembling breath, she rose and stepped after him. They left the station behind. The dusty road west stretched out before them, long and empty. Elias mounted his horse with ease, settling into the saddle like a man born there. Tina walked beside him, barefoot on the hard ground, her broad frame moving in silence. The wind lashed dust across her face, stinging her skin. Her feet bled where sharp stones cut into the flesh, but she didn't falter. Pride kept her upright, neither spoke. There was only the creak of leather, the rhythm of hoofbeats, and the sound of Tina's steady steps beside the horse. Elias glanced down at her once, but said nothing. She did not look up. Hours passed, and the sun sank beyond the horizon. Night crept over the prairie, stars glittering cold and sharp above them. By the time they reached the small ranch house, the moon hung high, silvering the edges of the broken fence and the leaning barn. Elias swung down from his horse and walked to the cabin door. He pushed it open, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting out. He set the suitcase inside, then stepped back. "There's room in here," he said simply. "If you want to leave, do it in the morning. If you stay, live like a human being." His words landed like stones, blunt and unpolished. Not kindness, not pity, just a plain statement carved from the truth. Tina stood at the threshold, her shadow spilling across the wooden floor. Doubt warred with hope inside her. Was this another man waiting to betray her? Or was this at last a door that wouldn't slam shut in her face? Her chest rose and fell once, twice. Then she stepped inside. That night, for the first time in years, she slept beneath a roof of her own. The bed was hard, the blanket patched, but it was clean and smelled faintly of sunlight. She lay awake staring at the low ceiling, listening to the wind howl across the prairie. For once, the sound didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like possibility. In the next room, Elias sat by the fire, his pipe resting cold beside him. He stared into the flames, his weathered face carved by memories he didn't share with anyone. He hadn't planned on bringing her here. He hadn't planned on letting anyone back into his life. But the image of her at that station, shoulders straight while the world tore her down, had lodged itself in him like a splinter he couldn't shake. He had buried a wife. He had buried a child, and with them he thought every reason to care. But that night, something stirred, a faint reminder that even a man made of stone could still feel the weight of another's suffering. Morning came with the sound of roosters crowing and the prairie wind sweeping dry grass. Pale light slipped through the cracks in the cabin wall, painting Tina's face. She rose slowly, her strong arms aching from years of carrying too much. The scars along her skin glowed faint in the light, reminders of a life spent fighting to exist. In the kitchen, Elias was already awake. He had stoked the fire, a small pot of bean soup simmering. Without a word, he placed a bowl in front of her and went back to slicing dried meat. Tina sat down cautiously, lifting the spoon with unsteady hands. The food was plain, but it was warm, and it filled her empty stomach in a way she hadn't known for days. She stole glances at the man across from her. He didn't stare, didn't leer. He simply worked, silent as always, every movement efficient and measured. That day passed slowly. Elias took his horse out into the field. Tina, without being asked, began sweeping the floor, straightening chairs, patching the curtain by the window. Her hands were clumsy, rough from labor, but each action carried a quiet determination, a plea to prove she was not useless. By afternoon, Elias returned with a bundle of firewood. When Tina stepped outside to help, her bare feet pressing into the cracked earth, he started to brush her off. But when he saw the resolve in her black eyes, he let her take half the load. Together they carried it inside, neither speaking, only the sound of their breaths mingling with the whisper of the wind. That evening, they sat at the dinner table, a single oil lamp casting golden light across the room. The silence was thick, stretching between them. Finally, Tina's voice broke it, low and uncertain. "Did you bring me here? Out of pity?" Elias looked up, gray eyes sharp in the dim glow. His voice was calm, steady. "No, I just didn't want to watch them treat you that way." The answer struck her deeper than any kindness could. After years of being seen as a burden, no one had ever spoken to her as if she were simply... And that night, as she lay on the hard bed, a new feeling stirred inside her chest. Not safety, not yet, but something fragile and rare. A sliver of hope. In Dry Hollow, word spread quickly. The oversized Apache woman had been taken in by Elias Ward. Some scoffed, others whispered. They said the lonely old rancher had lost his mind. But in the dark corner of the saloon, one man listened with a bitter sneer curling his lips. Caleb Morton. He had humiliated her at the station. He thought he had cast her aside for good. But now the thought of Tina finding a place, even in the house of another man, stung like fire in his pride. And Caleb Morton was not the kind of man who let humiliation rest. And so, the rancher's silent act of defiance, 3 words spoken at a dusty station, would spark something far greater than either of them could imagine, because the West was not kind to those who dared to stand against its cruelty, and for Elias and Tina, the hardest trials were still to come. The prairie morning stretched wide and endless, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin. Tina stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet meeting the cool wood, and let the rising sun spill across her face. It was a new day, though her heart still trembled with the weight of yesterday. Behind her, Elias moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had lived this life for years. He said little as he saddled his horse, checked the water trough, and hauled hay from the barn. The leather of his gloves creaked, his movements efficient, practiced. He didn't look at her, and he didn't need to. Tina lingered at the doorway, uncertain. The cabin was small, its boards weathered by wind and time, but it had a roof that did not leak, walls that did not crumble. For years she had known nothing but borrowed corners and cold ground, and now here was a space that could be hers, if she dared to claim it. She looked around. The table was scratched but solid. The chair near the fire leaned a little to one side. The floor carried dust and straw blown in from the fields. It wasn't much, but to Tina, it was more than she'd ever dreamed. Her suitcase still rested by the bed where Elias had placed it. She opened it and pulled out a single folded dress, worn but carefully kept. At the bottom lay a strip of cloth embroidered by her grandmother, the last remnant of her people she had never let go. She pressed it to her face, breathing in the faint scent of sage, before setting it on the table like a promise to herself. The hours passed slow. Elias worked outside and Tina busied herself inside. She picked up a broom leaning in the corner and began sweeping, pushing the dust into neat piles. She wiped the windows until the sunlight came through clearer. She patched the torn curtain with clumsy stitches. Her hands were not graceful, but they were determined. Every task she touched became more than a chore. It was her way of proving to herself she could belong. When Elias returned at midday, carrying a bundle of firewood, Tina stepped forward. "Let me," she said softly. At first, he started to wave her away, but then he caught the look in her eyes. A look that said she would not be treated as fragile, or useless, or unwanted. He hesitated, then set down part of the bundle. She lifted it, her muscles straining, but she did not falter. Together they carried the wood inside without a word. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. The second night at the ranch, Tina sat by the fire while Elias cleaned his rifle. The lamp cast shadows across his worn face, deepening the lines carved by years of solitude. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Why did you bring me here?" Elias looked up, his gray eyes steady, the firelight flickering in their depths. I didn't want to watch them treat you like that. She waited for more, for pity, for explanation, but that was all he said. Her heart thudded unevenly. For so long she had been seen as less, too big, too strange, too much. But this man had not looked at her as a burden. He had looked at her as a person. And though the words were few, they carried a weight she had never felt before. That night, lying on the hard wooden bed, she touched the patchwork quilt and let herself believe, just a little, that she might not always be alone. Days began to blend into one another. Tina rose at dawn, swept the cabin, and cooked when she could. Her cooking was rough, but Elias never complained. In the fields, she learned to carry water, mend fences, and help guide the cattle. At first, the townsfolk laughed when they saw her walking beside him at the edge of the prairie road, but slowly their laughter turned into whispers. Some shook their heads, muttering about a rancher losing his senses. Others watched with wary respect, unwilling to challenge the man who stood so firmly at her side. Still, in the dark corners of Dry Hollow, bitterness brewed. One afternoon, Tina was hanging clothes on a line stretched between two posts when she caught Elias watching her. She froze, embarrassed, thinking he might laugh at the way the fabric sagged under her rough stitches. But he only gave a short nod, like a man acknowledging work done with care. Her cheeks burned, though not from shame this time. Later, as they ate supper in the dim cabin, Elias finally spoke more than a sentence. "You work hard," he said simply. She set down her spoon, caught off guard. "I don't want to be a burden," she replied. His eyes held hers across the table. Unwavering. "You're not," the words rang inside her, louder than the wind howling outside. But peace in the west never lasted long. Rumors spread faster than wildfire, and they always reached the ears of the wrong man. Caleb Morton, the merchant who had humiliated her, seethed in anger when he heard the whispers in town. The Apache woman found a place. She lives at Ward's ranch now. She is not broken. His pride could not endure it. He had thrown her away like dirt. But to see her standing again in someone else's home burned him deeper than he could admit. And men like Caleb, wounded in their pride, could be dangerous. He sat in the saloon nursing a glass of whiskey, his eyes narrow as he spoke to a man known for blood and trouble, Jeb Mullen. The kind of man whose fists could break stone, whose presence drew silence from a room. Together they began to scheme. Back at the ranch, Tina did not yet know of the storm building beyond the horizon. She only knew the quiet rhythm of each day, the shared glances across the table, the unspoken partnership that grew with every task they endured side by side. And one night, as the fire burned low, she let herself whisper a truth she had never dared to say aloud. "I never thought I would have a place like this, even if it's only for a little while." "Thank you." Elias did not answer with words. He simply added another log to the fire, the glow flickering across his face. But in the silence, Tina understood. For the first time in her life, she had more than survival. She had a roof, a bed, and perhaps the beginnings of something she had almost given up on: belonging. And so, the ranch at the edge of the prairie became more than just a house of wood and stone. It became a fragile promise, a shelter for two souls marked by loss, beginning to stitch themselves together in the quiet shadows of the west. But whispers were already spreading in Dry Hollow. Whispers carried on whiskey breath and cruel laughter. And soon, those whispers would arrive at their doorstep with gunpowder and fire. Dry Hollow was a town that fed on whispers. Secrets rolled through its saloons faster than whiskey, and gossip traveled quicker than any rider. It didn't take long before every set of ears had heard the news. The oversized Apache woman, mocked and abandoned at the station, was now living at Elias Ward's ranch. The whispers carried laughter. "Ward's lost his mind. She's more ox than woman. They say she eats like a man and works like two." But mixed with the scorn came something else: curiosity. Elias was no fool. He was a man respected for his quiet resolve, the kind of man who didn't bend to the town's cruelty. If he had chosen to keep her, maybe there was more to her than people dared admit. Still, the saloon filled with snickers whenever her name was spoken. Glasses clinked, boots scuffed, and men leaned in close, muttering like coyotes sniffing a carcass. and in the darkest corner of that saloon sat Caleb Morton, the man who had cast her aside. His jaw clenched as he listened to the jokes. At first he tried to laugh along, to hide the sting in his pride. But each word burrowed deeper into his skin. She's not broken. She's working that ranch. Ward walks with her through town. Caleb's pride bled with every whisper. He had humiliated her, thrown her out before the whole town, and in his mind that should have ended her story. But instead she had found a place without him. His glass slammed against the table, whiskey sloshing over the edge. "She's mine," he spat under his breath. "She came here for me," but no one around him listened. No one cared. A hand as big as a slab of stone landed on his shoulder. Caleb looked up into the scarred face of Jeb Mullen. The man was notorious across 3 counties, thick arms, broken teeth, and eyes that glinted with the kind of violence that never needed reason. "You look troubled," Jeb growled. His voice like gravel under boots. Caleb straightened, forcing a smirk. "A rancher's taken what was mine." "I want her back," Jeb grinned, flashing yellowed teeth. "Then take her." Men like Ward think silence makes them strong. But silence don't stop bullets. Caleb's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. Pride wouldn't let him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Help me get her back, Jeb. You'll be paid more than you've seen in months." Jeb's grin widened. "I don't do it for money. I do it for sport. But I'll take your coin all the same." And so, a dark pact was sealed in the corner of that saloon. Whiskey, greed, and wounded pride bound 2 men together, and their eyes turned west, toward the ranch where Elias Ward and Tina had begun to build something fragile and new. Back at the ranch, Tina had no idea of the storm brewing. She rose each morning with the sun, sweeping the floor, cooking what little she could, and stepping into the fields beside Elias. At first, Elias tried to stop her from lifting heavy beams, from carrying water pails too large for her hands. But every time she met his eyes with that same quiet fire, and every time he let her work. One evening she bent over the fence rail, hammer in hand, sweat running down her arms as she set nails into place. Elias stood a few paces away, chopping wood. For the first time in years, he found himself watching someone not just survive, but fight to belong. When the last board was nailed in place, Tina stepped back, her chest heaving with effort. Elias gave a short nod, approval silent but certain. Tina's lips parted, almost a smile, though her eyes shimmered with something deeper. But the prairie had a way of reminding people that peace was fragile. In town, whispers turned sharper. Some muttered that Elias had taken her in out of loneliness. Others claimed she had bewitched him. A few muttered the ugliest word of all, witch. The gossip grew crueler with each retelling. At the general store, women whispered behind their hands. At the blacksmith's, men smirked and shook their heads. Children pointed when she walked through town beside Elias, calling her names, until their parents dragged them away, faces red with shame and fear. Tina felt their eyes. She always had, but now, with Elias beside her, something inside shifted. She did not lower her head as she once might have. Instead, she walked taller, her broad shoulders squared, her dark eyes unyielding. For the first time, someone walked beside her without shame, and that meant more than all the whispers in the world. Still, the tension built. One afternoon, as they left the general store, sacks of nails and seed in Elias's hands, a figure stepped into their path. Jeb Mullen. The street went silent. Doors creaked open. Eyes peeked from windows. Jeb's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "This woman belongs to my boss. Hand her over, Ward, and walk away." The air snapped taut as a gun string. Elias set the sack down carefully, his gray eyes steady on Jeb. Then he glanced at Caleb Morton, lurking in the shadows just behind the brute, his smirk thin and cowardly. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Elias said, voice calm, sharp as steel. "She chooses where she stands. And she's standing with me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For a heartbeat, silence froze the street. Then Jeb sneered, one massive hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. Tina's heart pounded as she stood behind Elias, but for the first time in her life, she felt something she had never known, someone standing in front of her. Not to shame her, but to shield her. The tension stretched to breaking. Every finger twitched, every breath held. Then Caleb's voice cracked through the air, sharp with false bravado. "Not here. Not now." Jeb snarled but stepped back, his eyes promising blood another day. Together, they retreated down the street, leaving only the echo of their threat. The crowd exhaled. Whispers started again, harsher than before. Some nodded with respect. Others shook their heads, certain Elias had doomed himself. But Tina heard only one thing, Elias Ward's voice, calm and steady, claiming her in front of them all. That night, as firelight flickered across the cabin walls, Tina sat by the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she turned her gaze toward Elias, her voice low but steady. "You stood for me today." He didn't look up from the rifle he was oiling. "I said the truth." Tina's breath trembled. The truth. That she was not a thing to be owned. Not a mistake to be hidden. That she was a woman who could choose. And someone had said it aloud, before the whole town. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she felt a fragile thread of belonging weaving itself through her heart. But outside, in the saloon's smoky corners, Caleb and Jeb sharpened their knives and poured more whiskey. Dry Hollow whispered louder now. Whispers of fire, of vengeance, of a storm that would not pass without blood. And the ranch on the western prairie, lit by its single oil lamp, stood waiting, unaware of the shadows drawing near. Dry Hollow had always been a place of spectacle. When fights broke out, when tempers flared, the whole town seemed to gather, eager for blood. That morning was no different. Elias and Tina had come into town for nothing more than supplies, salt, nails, a sack of flour. But even the simple act of walking down Main Street together drew eyes. Mothers tugged their children close. Men paused mid-conversation, their voices dropping to whispers. The sight of the Apache woman towering beside the silent rancher was enough to hush the town like a sudden storm cloud. Tina kept her chin high, though inside her heart pounded. She felt their stares burning into her, every whisper cutting deeper than a blade. But Elias walked steady, shoulders squared, unbothered, as though the whole street belonged to him. His calm presence wrapped around her like a shield. And then, from the shadow of the saloon, Jeb Mullen stepped forward. The giant brute filled the street, scars slashing across his face, fists like mallets dangling near the pistol at his hip. Behind him, Caleb Morton lingered, smirk sharp with cowardice. The crowd parted. Silence spread. Jeb's voice rumbled through the dust. "This woman belongs to my boss. Hand her over, Ward. Walk away while you still can." The words echoed like thunder. Elias set the sack of flour down slowly on the ground, his every movement deliberate, controlled. His gray eyes lifted to meet Jeb's, cold and steady as iron. "She doesn't belong to you," Elias said, his voice calm but cutting like a blade. "And she doesn't belong to me either. She chooses where she stands, and she's standing with me." The crowd gasped. Murmurs rippled down the street. The declaration rang louder than gunfire. Caleb's smirk faltered, rage flickering across his face. Jeb's lips twisted into a sneer. "You got a sharp tongue for a man who lives alone," Jeb growled, his hand hovering over the pistol grip. "Let's see if you can back it up." The air snapped taut. Every man on the street shifted, ready to dive for cover. Women pulled their children inside, shutters banging closed. Tina stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had seen cruelty. She had seen betrayal. But she had never seen a man step into danger for her. Elias stood firm, silent, his lean frame straight as a fence post, one hand resting near his Colt. The sun glared down, casting long shadows. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then Caleb's voice cracked the tension. "Not here. Not now," he hissed, pulling at Jeb's arm. The brute snarled, but Caleb's pride wasn't strong enough to risk blood in broad daylight. The law might forgive whispers and laughter, but it wouldn't forgive bullets in the middle of Main Street. Not yet. Reluctantly, Jeb stepped back, his sneer promising this wasn't finished. The two men retreated, boots crunching against the dirt, swallowed by the saloon shadow once more. The crowd exhaled all at once. Whispers erupted, harsher than ever. "He's mad. He's going to get himself killed. Ward's not afraid of them." Did you see the way he looked at Jeb? But Tina heard only one thing. The words Elias had spoken, clear and unwavering. She chooses where she stands. That night, back at the ranch, the fire crackled low. Tina sat in silence, staring at her calloused hands folded in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "You stood in front of me today." Elias didn't look up from the rifle he was cleaning. "I said what was true," Tina's breath caught. The truth, that she was not an object, not a burden, not something to be owned or cast aside. She was a woman with the right to choose. And someone had spoken it aloud before an entire town. Her voice dropped, soft as a whisper. "No one has ever done that for me." Elias glanced up then, his gray eyes steady. "Then maybe it's about time." For a long moment, the silence between them shifted. It was no longer heavy with distance, but alive with something new: respect, recognition, and the first fragile threads of trust. In Dry Hollow, however, the silence in the saloon was broken by Caleb's furious ranting. His pride had been torn open in front of everyone, and he drowned his shame in whiskey. Jeb sat beside him, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, his scarred face glinting in the lamplight. "He humiliated me," Caleb snarled. "Right in front of the whole damn town." Jeb didn't look up. "Then we finish it. Not in the street, not where the law can see. We'll take the ranch. Burn it to the ground if we have to. He'll come crawling back." Caleb's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Do it, make him pay." The pact was sealed. Whiskey, hatred, and wounded pride lit the fuse of violence. Back at the ranch, Tina lay awake in the dark, the words echoing through her chest. She chooses where she stands. For the first time in her life, she believed it. And in the quiet glow of the dying fire, she made a vow to herself. She would stand by Elias Ward, not because he had given her a roof, not because he had defended her name, but because he had seen her as no one else ever had. Human, worthy, strong. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night, "I will not run anymore." And though the wind howled outside within the cabin's walls, a fragile seed of belonging began to grow. The showdown in the street had ended without bullets, but the war had only just begun. Elias and Tina had drawn a line in the dust, and men like Caleb Morton and Jeb Mullen never walked away from a challenge. Out there, in the dark corners of the West, vengeance was stirring, and soon the prairie itself would burn with it. The ranch survived on silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the steady rhythm of work, the sound of hammers on wood, the creak of saddles, the whisper of wind sweeping the prairie grass. In those weeks after the showdown, Elias and Tina found themselves bound not by words, but by labor. The days stretched long, the sun unforgiving, but every evening they came home together, weary yet alive. Elias was a man of few sentences. He spoke in nods, in the weight of his gaze, in the way his hands knew what needed doing. And Tina, who had lived a lifetime carrying others' scorn, slowly began to fill the space around him, not as a shadow, but as a presence. One morning, Elias returned from the pasture carrying a heavy sack of feed. As he bent to drop it, Tina stepped forward, her calloused hands gripping the other end. "I can help," she said. Elias glanced at her, ready to wave her off. But her eyes, black as obsidian, burned with determination. Slowly he let go, and together they carried the weight across the yard. Neither spoke, but in that simple act something shifted. That night, when Elias lit the lamp, Tina sat beside the fire, sewing a tear in the old curtain. The rough thread pulled awkwardly through the cloth, her fingers clumsy but stubborn. When Elias saw, he didn't laugh. He didn't mock her efforts. He simply nodded once, his face unreadable, and said, "It'll hold." The words were few, but they wrapped around her like warmth. Life at the ranch followed a rhythm. At dawn, Elias fed the horses while Tina drew water from the well, her strong arms hauling the bucket with ease. At midday, they worked side by side, patching fences, stacking firewood, tending the small vegetable garden, and at dusk they shared a table. The food was plain: beans, bread, salted meat, but each meal carried the taste of survival, of two souls who had chosen to stay instead of walking away. Elias never asked her to explain her past. Tina never asked about the woman's picture he kept tucked inside the old Bible on the shelf. Some stories lived in silence, and silence was something both of them understood well. One evening, Elias noticed her limping slightly, her strong legs stiff as she bent near the corral. He set his tools aside and brought out a small tin of herbs. "Sit," he ordered simply. Tina hesitated. unused to anyone tending to her. But the firm steadiness in his eyes left no room for refusal. She lowered herself to the porch step, and Elias knelt before her. His rough fingers pressed the cool paste to the old scar along her shin. She winced but did not pull away. Her gaze fixed on him, searching. Not for pity. She'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. What she saw instead was respect. Quiet, unspoken respect. Better, Elias muttered when he finished, and he rose without another word. Tina's throat tightened. No man had ever knelt before her without trying to break her first. The whispers in Dry Hollow didn't stop. They never would. The rancher's lost his mind. She'll ruin him yet. She's too big, too strange, too wild. But when Elias walked into town with Tina by his side, the whispers stayed whispers. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. His hand sometimes brushed hers as they moved through the crowd, and that was louder than any gossip. For Tina, every step was both a trial and a triumph. She still heard the laughter. She still remembered the station platform where her world had broken. But each time Elias walked beside her, silent and steady, she found the courage to keep her head high. One night, a storm rolled across the prairie. Rain pounded the roof and thunder shook the walls. Tina woke with a start, memories of mockery and fire flooding her mind. She rose to the window, pressing her forehead against the glass. Lightning lit her face, scarred and weary. Behind her, Elias stirred. His voice came low, like gravel smoothed by time. "Storm will pass," Tina turned. "They'll come back," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. "The man from the saloon. The brute. They won't let this end." Elias's gray eyes met hers. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. "Then we'll be ready." The words were simple, but they rooted deep inside her. Not "you'll be ready," not "I'll be ready." For a woman who had spent her life alone, that one word was enough to break her fear. The days grew longer. The work grew heavier. But in the rhythm of the ranch, something unexpected took root. One afternoon, as Elias fixed the barn door, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. Tina stood nearby. Hair pulled back, sleeves rolled to her shoulders, trying to hammer a nail straight. The nail bent sideways, the board split, and instead of cursing, she laughed. A rough, deep laugh that startled even herself. Elias looked up, surprised. The corners of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Never thought I'd hear that," he said. "Neither did I," Tina admitted, breathless. Her black eyes glowed with something softer than he'd ever seen. The sound lingered long after the hammer fell silent. Carrying into the prairie night? But far across town? In the saloon, another kind of sound stirred. The scrape of knives. The clink of whiskey glasses. The low murmur of men plotting. Caleb Morton had not forgotten his humiliation. Jeb Mullen had not forgiven his wound. And as the moon climbed high above the prairie, the storm they were brewing promised to be far darker than thunder and rain. The moon rose like a blade over the prairie, thin and cold. Wind combed the grass until it hissed. Inside the little cabin, the lamplight burned low, throwing a soft halo over the table where Elias finished checking his Winchester. He didn't say he felt it coming, but he did. Some nights carry a taste of iron, and this was one of them. Tina stood at the window, her silhouette carved against the dark. She'd long since tied back her hair and rolled her sleeves, the scars along her forearms catching the lamplight like pale thread. She listened to the night with a warrior's breath, quiet in, quiet out, waiting for the first wrong sound. It came as a quiver through the earth, hoofbeats, more than a handful. Too many for neighbors, too fast for men with good intentions. Elias set the rifle down and blew out the lamp. The cabin fell into shadow and the stars outside sharpened like flint. "They're here," he said, voice low. Tina didn't move from the window. "We knew they would be." Across the yard, the old dog rose to its feet and huffed a warning. Then on the ridge, figures formed, black riders against a poured silver sky. A wagon creaked behind them, torches guttering in its bed. Jeb Mullen's broad-shouldered outline led the pack. Beside him, slightly behind, sat Caleb Morton, hunched, mean and small under all that night. Elias's movements were clean, economical. He slid the Winchester to the edge of the table, snapped open a box of cartridges, and nodded toward the stove. "Carbines there." Tina's hand found the short-barreled gun without looking. The wood was worn smooth by Elias's palm. Felt like certainty. Listen to me, Elias said, stepping close enough that she could feel the heat of him. The steadiness. We don't give up ground. We don't give up each other. You hear? Her answer was a single firm nod. I hear. Torches bloomed on the ridge, little suns flickering in the dark. The men rode down like a storm. The dog barked twice, and then the first shot cracked, shattering the top pane of the front window. Glass hissed across the floorboards. Ward! Jeb roared from the yard, his voice thick with triumph. Bring out the woman. Bring her now, and you might see morning. Elias slid to the window's edge, sighted down the barrel, and answered with a shot that took the top off Jeb's fence post, splinters flying. You'll see morning when you earn it, he said, calm as rain. Shadows surged. 2 men peeled off toward the barn. Another pair fanned wide with torches. Jeb himself strode up the path, axe in one fist, pistol in the other, teeth flashing in the torchlight. Behind him, Caleb lurked in the back, voice cutting high and mean. She's mine, Ward. She came for me. Not tonight, Elias murmured, and fired again. One of the torchmen dropped like a sack into the dirt. The other tossed his flame into the thatch of the feed shed out of reflex, missing the barn, but finding dry tinder all the same. Fire licked up fast, throwing heat across the yard. Roof, Tina said, already moving. Elias shouldered the door as 2 riders pounded past. She slipped out the side, silent fast, hugging Shadow. The carbine held close. She sprinted for the rain barrel, seized the sloshing bucket, and dashed it across the new flames. Steam rose. The fire dimmed, then flared again as another torch sailed from the dark and stuck like a cruel star in the eaves. Gunfire split the air. Elias dropped a second rider from his saddle, then ducked as bullets stung the doorway like hornets. The old dog barked once more and fell silent, and something in Elias's chest went cold and hard. He worked the lever, brass singing from the Winchester, and thought only of where Tina's feet would fall next. She was already there, on the shed roof. How she'd climbed. Even she couldn't have said, ripping the torch free with a bare hand and heaving it into the dirt. Her palm sizzled. She bit back a sound, rolled, and looked over the yard. Jeb saw her. He grinned. There you are, he swung the axe. Tina dropped from the roof, hit the dirt in a crouch, and fired twice. One of Jeb's men turned a full circle and collapsed. The other's horse spooked and bolted. Jeb didn't flinch. He holstered the pistol and came on with the axe, big and eager. The barn door shuttered behind her, cattle lowing, hooves thumping in panic. Tina spared a glance. If the barn caught, they'd lose everything. Elias, she called loud enough to cut the gunfire. The herd. I've got you, he shot back, which meant he'd take Jeb from the side if he got the angle, which meant trust. Jeb lunged, axe whistling low. Tina turned her body and let it pass, felt the wind of it on her knee. She brought the carbine butt up, smashed it into his cheek, heard his grunt of surprise. He staggered, then came back laughing, blood slicking his teeth. I like you angry, he said. Makes you clumsy. She wasn't. But pain bit her burned palm and sweat stung her eyes, and Jeb had fought a lifetime with men who quit first. He swung again, a fast, ugly cut. She met it with the steel of her knife. She'd drawn it without thinking. And sparks leapt like fireflies in the dark. He muscled her backward toward the fence. Across the yard, Elias stepped into the open just long enough to take the wheel off the torch wagon with a single shot. It slewed and fell, spilling flame into the dust. Another rider wheeled to meet him, and Elias answered with the Colt, 2 shots, 2 problems solved. Then he moved, calculating angles, searching for a clean line on Jeb that wouldn't touch Tina. Torch the house, Caleb shrieked from the back. Burn them out! A bottle arced through the night and broke on the cabin wall, liquor catching with a whoosh. Fire licked up the rough boards. Elias's head snapped toward the glow. He saw 20 years of solitude cracking under the heat, every memory of loss in the flames. Then he saw Tina pinned against the fence and chose. He shot the man with the lit rag first. Tina felt the fence rail bite her spine. Jeb's forearm pressed like a bar across her chest. She could smell his breath, rot and whiskey. Her burned hand slipped on the knife handle. He leaned closer, voice like gravel and hunger. You come quiet, he said, or I. The sentence ended in a bellow. Tina twisted, dropped her weight, and drove her knee into the side of his leg. Something in it popped. Jeb howled and staggered. She slammed her forehead into his nose, stars bursting behind her eyes. He reeled, blood pouring, And that was when Elias took the opening. One clean shot that knocked the axe from Jeb's hand. Wood exploding into splinters. Jeb stared at the stump of the handle, then at Elias. He smiled a red smile. "You should have killed me." "Working on it," Elias said, and the words were a promise. 3 more riders charged the porch. Elias turned, fired twice, felt the 3rd bullet crease his shoulder like a hot wire. He stumbled, teeth clenched, and put the man down anyway. Smoke clawed at the windows. Flames licked the eaves. The dog lay still by the steps. "Barn," Tina said again, breath ragged, eyes on the jittering firelight skittering across the roofline. "If we lose it, I know." Elias's voice stayed steady. He tossed her the Colt. "Drive them out. I'll hold the yard." She caught the gun left-handed, her burned palm useless, and ran. Bullets stitched dirt at her heels. She hit the barn doors with her shoulder, slid inside, and was swallowed by frantic sound. Snorting, pounding, the frantic clatter of hooves. She moved among them like a woman born to it, voice low and fierce. Easy, easy. They felt her calm more than heard it. She cut the tie rope on the first stall, slapped the gelding's rump. He bolted for the open, nearly trampling a man who'd tried to circle around. She threw the bar on the big doors wide, light and smoke boiling in. One by one, the animals surged out into the yard, dust and heat and life bursting past her. Outside, Jeb came again, limping but murderous, a knife in his fist now. Elias pivoted to meet him, blood slicking his sleeve. They closed like old enemies. Jeb slashed. Elias stepped inside it, caught his wrist and hammered an elbow into the brute's ribs. Bone thudded. Jeb laughed through the pain and drove a headbutt that sent stars across Elias's vision. The world tilted, then righted. "Ward!" Caleb shrieked from somewhere behind the wagon. "You'll crawl before I'm done." Elias didn't waste breath answering. He dropped his weight, twisted Jeb's knife hand, and felt the tendons give. The blade clattered away. Jeb snarled and went for Elias's throat barehanded, thumbs digging. Elias brought the Winchester's stock up like a cudgel and cracked it across Jeb's ear. Jeb's eyes went glassy, not out. Not yet. A fresh flare lit the cabin wall. A second bottle smashed. The flames climbed, greedy now, tasting old pine and dry chinking. Heat blew across the yard. Caleb's laughter broke high and mean. "Burn, you stubborn fool. Burn with her." Tina kicked the last stall bar and shoved the final skittish mare into the night, then turned, just in time to see the cabin flame up like a lantern. The sight punched the breath from her. That room had been her first roof, her first bed, her first quiet. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She ran straight for the pantry window on the north wall, still dark, still cool, and hurled her shoulder into the shutters until the hinge tore. Smoke clawed at her throat. She plunged inside, grabbed the old quilt, beat madly at the first hungry tongues that licked the doorway. The room hissed and spat. Her eyes watered. Her lungs burned. Outside, Jeb found his feet again and barreled at Elias like a bull, rage making him blind to pain. He slammed Elias into the porch post so hard the wood shuddered. Elias felt something hot and wet go loose at the back of his ribs and tasted copper. Jeb drew back a fist the size of a brick. "Tina!" Elias barked. "Here," she coughed from the smoke. She burst through the doorway with a sloshing bucket. She'd kicked the rain barrel and upended it through the broken pantry window and dashed the water across the flaming sill. Steam blinded all 3 of them for a heartbeat. In that white roar, Elias drove the Winchester's barrel into Jeb's gut and pulled the trigger point blank. The shot took the air from Jeb's lungs like a fist. He folded over, wheezing, shock painted across his blood-wet face. Not dead, stubborn, brutal thing. He swayed, grabbed a porch post, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, grinning like a wolf who'd found a new edge to his teeth. "Gonna take more than that?" "Happy to oblige," Elias said, and then a 4th shot split the steam, wild and stupid. It wasn't meant for anyone. It was Caleb, nerves frayed, firing from the hip. The bullet chewed into the porch beam an inch from Tina's head, splinters cutting her cheek. Something in Elias changed. The last of his patience burned away. He pivoted off the post and sent a single round snapping through the haze, straight into the shoulder of the silhouette behind the wagon. Caleb shrieked, dropped the pistol, and went down hard, clutching his arm. The men on the ridge, those who still had enough good sense left, started pulling back. The torch wagon lay on its side, wheel broken. 2 bodies were cooling in the dust. The shed smoked savable. The cabin sputtered where Tina's water had shocked it, the flames hesitating in their climb, as if reconsidering the taste of this house. Jeb looked around and understood he was losing. Rage roared up to fill the space where sense should have lived. He lunged, not for Elias this time, but for the pantry door, for the woman, for the one thing he could still destroy to make victory out of hell. Tina saw it in his eyes and moved to meet him. Her burned palm screamed when she tightened on the knife. She didn't care. He came in swinging. She stepped past and slashed along the line of his forearm, shallow but smarting. He bellowed and grabbed her wrist, their bodies crashing into the doorframe. "Let her go," Elias said. "Voice flat, make me," Jeb panted. Grinning through blood, Elias raised the Colt. Breath sight. Squeeze. A shadow flitted in the corner of his vision, the mare bolting past, the smoke scudding low. He held his shot a hair too long to spare Tina. Jeb used it, heaving her sideways into the pantry table. Glass shattered. Flour puffed up like a white ghost. Then the valley answered. Coyotes yipped from the ridge. Hoofbeats drummed a retreat. The fire cracked and hissed as if a sudden night breeze had scolded it. Men shouted. Jeb's riders hauling Caleb up by the good arm, cursing, stumbling. Someone called, "Enough! Ride, damn you!" And one by one they did, fear finally sobering the drunk, the cruel, the coward. Jeb stood alone in the yard, chest heaving, eyes gone small. He backed away 3 steps, blood stringing from his nose to his lip. "This ain't done," he gurgled, voice ragged. "It is for tonight," Elias said. Jeb spat red into the dirt, limped to a riderless horse, and hauled himself into the saddle with a roar of pain. He wheeled once as if carving their faces into his memory, and thundered off, following the ragged tail of his men into the dark. Silence fell, ruined, smoky, ringing with what had just almost been. Tina leaned a shoulder into the pantry door jamb and slid down until she was sitting on the step. Her breath came in sharp pulls. Her burned palm trembled. Elias lowered the Colt and stood very still, listening for one more hoofbeat, one more lie from the dark. None came. They looked at each other through the thinning smoke. Her cheek was nicked from the splinters. His shirt was black with blood at the shoulder. The dog lay still. The shed steamed like a scolded beast. The cabin walls glowed but did not climb. "We held," Tina said, voice raw. "We did," Elias answered. He crossed the yard, tucked the Winchester under his arm, and held out his good hand. She took it. He pulled her up steady and sure. For a moment, with the wreckage around them and the stars above, they stood with foreheads almost touching, breathing the same ragged breath. "We'll fix what we can," he said. "We'll bury what we must. We'll rebuild," she answered. From the far hills, an answering calm slid down the grass. The herd settled. The wind turned cooler. Somewhere an owl called. The night didn't apologize, but it did ease. Elias squeezed her hand once and let go. "Dawn's not far." "No," she said. "It isn't." They moved then, bucket after bucket, stamping embers, checking stock, covering the still body of the old dog with the quilt that had once been her only beauty. By the time the eastern sky lifted from black to bruised purple, the fire was beaten to steam, the yard to silence, and 2 figures stood side by side in the wreckage of a life not yet lost. At the edge of the porch, Elias's knees went soft for half a heartbeat. He put a hand against the post and hid it as best he could. Blood still dripped from the crease in his shoulder. Tina saw anyway. "Sit," she said. He smirked a little. "You ordering me?" "Yes," he sat. She bound the wound with sure, careful hands, her burned palm resting cool against his skin. When she finished, she looked up, eyes black and bright in the faint light. "They'll come again," she said. "Maybe," Elias answered. "Maybe the town will come first. For us?" "For the truth," he said. They both looked toward the road to Dry Hollow, where, just then, 3 specks appeared on the ridge, sun shoulders behind them. Not riders with torches, wagons with crates, hammers laid across saddles, neighbors who chose to be brave. The wind shifted and carried the soft creak of wheels. Tina's jaw tightened, but not with fear this time. She stood, hair loose, shoulders straight, and nodded once. "Dawn," she said again, not like a time, but like a vow. Dawn, Elias echoed. Together they faced it. The prairie smelled of smoke and iron. The cabin walls were blackened but still standing, and the barn moaned like a wounded animal as the last of the fire clung stubbornly to the rafters. Dawn had not yet come, and already the night had cost them blood, beasts, and breath. But one thing remained. They were still alive. Jeb Mullen staggered in the yard, his face streaked with soot and blood. The axe was gone, the pistol empty, but the hatred in his eyes burned hotter than the fire behind him. He limped toward Tina, murder in every step, teeth bared like a cornered wolf. Tina squared her stance, knife in her hand, her burned palm shaking but steady enough. The steam rising from the soaked earth wrapped them both in a ghostly haze. Her chest rose and fell like a war drum. She had spent years carrying shame that wasn't hers, listening to the world call her too large, too ugly, too much. Tonight the world would call her something else. Jeb lunged, snarling. Tina let him come. At the last second, she pivoted, her body moving with the grace of every scar and every mile she had carried. The blade flashed once, carving across his forearm. He roared but kept coming, swinging a fist big as stone. It caught her shoulder and spun her sideways, but she didn't fall. She spun with it, dropped low, and drove her knee into his ribs. Bone cracked. He spat blood into the dirt. "Stay down," she growled, her voice hoarse but steady. But Jeb didn't know how. He came again, slower this time, staggering, his rage dragging him forward when his body had already lost. He grappled with her, their bodies colliding, rolling in the ash. He smelled of whiskey and sweat, she of smoke and iron. He tried to crush her throat with his bare hands. She tore free, slammed her brow into his face, and felt the crunch of cartilage give way. His scream ripped through the night. Elias was there in a heartbeat, rifle raised. But he didn't fire. He saw it. The moment when Tina pushed back, towering above Jeb, knife pressed to his throat, her black eyes burning like coals pulled from the fire. Her chest heaved, her arm trembled, but her will did not break. "You will never own me," she hissed, the blade biting his skin. Jeb froze. For the first time, there was no laughter in him, only fear. Fear of the strength he could not beat, of a woman the world had tried to cast aside but who now stood unbroken, holding his life in her hands. Elias's voice cut through, steady as stone. "That's enough, Tina. Let him crawl away and carry the shame of this night." Her knife lingered at his throat, long enough for him to feel the edge of his death. Then with a sharp motion, she pulled back and shoved him into the dirt. He sprawled there, wheezing, eyes wild. He scrambled to his feet and staggered to a waiting horse. Blood dripped down his arm as he hauled himself into the saddle. He spat one last curse, then rode off into the burning horizon, broken but alive. Silence settled heavy. Only the hiss of dying fire and the low, frightened calls of cattle filled the air. Tina stood in the yard, chest heaving, soot streaking her bronze skin. The knife still trembled in her grip. Elias came to her side, his hand resting firm and steady on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You fought and you won." Tina looked at him, eyes shining not with victory but with something deeper. Relief. For the first time in her life, she had not been cast aside. She had not been mocked, abandoned, or left to bleed alone. She had stood, and someone had stood beside her. The ranch was scarred, the house blackened, the shed broken, the dog gone, but it still stood. And so did they. Elias turned to her, voice quiet but carrying the weight of a promise. "From this night on, no one decides who you are but you." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She wiped the blood from her knife, sheathed it, and finally let herself lean into him. For a long moment they stood together in the smoke and ruin, breathing as one. Above them, the first pale streak of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. The night of fire had ended, and with it a new day waited to begin. By morning, the prairie was painted in gray. Smoke curled from the blackened roof beams, and the air still carried the acrid bite of fire. The ranch looked battered, scarred by gunfire and flame, but it was standing, and so were they. Tina moved slowly through the wreckage, her strong arms hauling fallen timbers, her bare feet crunching across shards of charred wood. Every scar, every burn on her body spoke of the night before, but she did not move like a broken woman. She moved like a survivor who had finally been given something worth protecting. Elias worked beside her, hammering planks, driving nails with steady hands. He did not speak often. He never had. But every time his eyes lifted to watch her, lifting more than her weight, her face streaked with ash but her back unyielding, there was something new in his gaze. Not just respect, not just gratitude, something deeper, quieter. A man who had lived too long in silence, suddenly realizing his silence no longer belonged to him alone. The town whispered. Of course they did. In the saloon, men muttered about the giant Apache woman who fought like a demon and left Jeb Mullen bleeding in the dirt. Some laughed, others sneered. But when Elias walked into town the next week with Tina at his side, holding her hand openly, the laughter died. He did not hide her. He did not walk ahead of her. He walked with her. And in that simple act, the town began to see something else. Not a woman too large, not a castaway, but a wife beside her husband. Life settled into rhythm. Tina mended fences, split wood, and learned the quiet language of the ranch. Elias taught her how to ride his gray stallion, her frame awkward at first, but soon moving in harmony with the animal. At night, she cooked beans and stew while he lit his pipe, the glow of the fire catching the lines of their faces. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of trust, of comfort, of something neither dared name but both carried in their hearts. Weeks passed, and the land healed. So did they. One morning, the doctor rode in from Prescott, summoned by an old friend to check on Elias's lingering cough and Tina's half-healed wounds. He was a blunt man, gray-mustached and sharp-eyed. After tending to Elias, he turned his attention to Tina, who stood tall though her shoulder still ached from the battle. He pressed her wrist, listened to her heart, and finally smiled, a rare thing on his stern face. "You're strong," he said, "and stronger still because of what you carry." Tina frowned. "What I carry?" The doctor nodded. "A child. 2 months along, I'd wager." The words fell like a soft thunderclap. For a moment, neither Tina nor Elias spoke. She stared at the floor, one broad hand instinctively brushing her stomach. All her life, she had been told she was too much, too big, too wrong. But now, life was growing inside her. Fragile, yes, but real. Elias sat very still, his weathered hands folded together. Memories flickered across his face. The fever that had taken his first wife and child. The years of silence that followed. The loneliness he had carried like a second skin. And now this, a chance he had never thought he would have again. When the doctor left, the ranch was quiet. Tina stood on the porch, staring out at the endless sweep of prairie. Her black eyes shimmered with something she did not yet know how to name. Elias came to her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I thought I had lost the chance to be a father," he said, voice low, rough with old pain. "And I thought I had lost the chance to be a husband, but you've given me both." She turned to him, tears streaking down her cheeks, and for once she did not try to hide them. "I never thought I would live to call any place home." He wrapped his arm around her, steady and firm, pulling her against him. "Then let this be your home, our home. No matter what the world says." The prairie wind swept past them, carrying with it the smell of dust, grass, and distant rain. The scars of fire still marked the ranch, but within its walls, a family had begun. That night, beneath a sky littered with stars, Tina rested her head on Elias's shoulder. For the first time in her life, she was not simply surviving. She was living. And in his silence, she heard the truth. She was no longer alone. In the Wild West, where men with guns often chose who lived and who died, they had chosen each other. That was their victory. That was their legacy. And in that quiet moment, wrapped in starlight and smoke, they were no longer a castaway and a lonely rancher. They were a family, and they were home.